I didn't touch it. In chapter 10, verse 39, we have this transition statement. People who are not turning back, but we're not of those who turn back to perdition or draw back to perdition or destruction, but we're those who believe to the saving of the soul. So we're not those who give up. We're those who continue on all the way to the saving of our souls. And then we have in verse 11, we have a list of examples of those who could have turned back, who could have given up, who could have turned away, but instead they continued on, and now we recognize them as heroes of the faith. So last week we looked at Abel, we looked at Enoch, we looked at Noah. In verse 8, where we're picking up today, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Hey, Mendel Forrest, you want to turn off the speakers out here? I sound like Charlton Heston. Thank you. All right, so in verse 8, by faith, when we see this word faith in chapter 11, think trust. They trust what God said. Because why did Abraham go? Why did Abraham leave home? Because God told him to. Okay, and God said, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to do all these great things. Did Abraham have any proof at that time? No. But what did he do? He trusted God. He didn't have any realization of what he needed to do, of any fulfillment of those promises at that time, but God said, go, and Abraham went. So he called to go up from the place to the place that he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Verse 9, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country. That goes with what we see, it builds up in verse 10, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. But did Abraham have a home, a worldly home really, once he left, once he followed God? No. He's essentially homeless for the whole rest of his life. He's got no permanent place to go. And we remember we read when Sarah died, he has to go and trade with somebody to actually have a place to bury her. He's got nothing there. And we'll build on that in verse 13 when we get there. Well, we've got by trust, Abraham left, and he dwelt in tents with Isaac and with Jacob. For they were waiting for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. In verse 10, what is that city?
New Jerusalem.
The New Jerusalem? What's the New Jerusalem?
I think it's the Revelation story at the end where Jesus is preparing New Jerusalem right now, and it does come down.
last chapter. So when we see city, keep in mind that they were waiting for this city. They were faithful because they had an expectation of that city. We also are faithful because we have an expectation of that city that God lays the foundations of. Verse 11, by faith Sarah also received strength to conceive, and she bore a child when she was past the age because she judged him faithful who had promised. When does Sarah get the promise that she's going to have a kid? When she's very old, when she's 90, and then she has the kid sometime after that. So Sarah, by faith, by trust, she received strength to have that kid, even though she was very old at the time. Therefore, from one man, in verse 12, and him as good as dead, were born as many of the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. We're going to come back to this, but remember, Abraham received 3 promises. Who remembers what those 3 promises were? Land, seed, family, descendants, and all nations are going to be blessed. So we're going to come back to that here in a little bit. So verse 12, for from one man and him as good as dead. This guy who was so old he might as well have been dead, like Dave Stewart, has a kid. And from that we have this great innumerable number of descendants from, he was 100 and she was 90 when that promise was renewed there, when we see Sarah falling on her face and laughing, and the angel in the next room is like, no. You laughed when you heard this, but this is really going to happen. Anything on that section? Anything on this paragraph there? Sorry, I'm trying to rush through a little bit because I'm counting weeks before we get to the end of the year and how many chapters we still have to cover before I have to wrap up at the end of the year. So in verse 13, these folks that we talked about already, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So verse 13, these all died in faith. What is faith? Trust. They all died trusting God. They finished their whole earthly span, and when they were done, they still trusted God. They didn't turn back, which is the warning for these people who are receiving this letter. Dave?
They had their moments.
They did have their moments.
And that's what's so impressive about it, because they're like we are. We will have our moments. Abraham, didn't turn his wife into a sister a couple of times. And,
Right.
He didn't believe he was going to have a son promise, so he had another son.
Right.
So they had their moments, which is encouraging to me, because I can correlate. But they still kept their trust, even after having their moments.
Right. So if you didn't hear, he's talking about how these examples that we have weren't flawless. They had weakness, but did they maintain their faith through their life? I mean, to various degrees, yeah. But I think that's why when we get...
It grows and it gets stronger as you watch them.
It should. Yeah. But I think that's why we see when we get to chapter 12, the first 3 verses of chapter 12, we're told to focus on not these examples that we have. We're told to focus on Christ. Because these examples, however great they are still fallible. They still showed weakness, which is recorded for our, really it would be recorded for our encouragement and our benefit. If we only ever saw examples that were perfect, the second I make a mistake, am I living up to this example? No, but we see that these folks trusted God and were rewarded for it, even when we see all the warts and all the foibles that we have recorded for them. So they all died in faith, not having received the promises. So, did these folks get the promises? No. But in verse 17, which we haven't read yet, did Abraham receive promises by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So did they receive promises or not receive promises? He did.
He did.
How many?
He was promised a son and got it.
Okay. What else was he promised?
Great descendants.
Did he have those yet? He had one. What else was he promised? Land. Did he have land? No. What else was he promised? All the nations would be blessed. Did he get that? No. So, all these folks, remember, they're promised that city with foundations that God promised. We're going to see this third promise to Abraham where all the nations are blessed. We're going to be referenced later at the end of this chapter, and it's going to be called the promise, because it's one that's referenced throughout the Old Testament scriptures as the promise. Well, when does that promise, where all the nations are blessed through the descendants of Abraham, when is that one realized? When Jesus comes and when Jesus dies. So there's all these promises to these individuals that aren't realized. Now, did they still trust God even though they didn't see the end result of what he'd promised? Absolutely. So these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They were assured of them, they embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So they received these promises, but they glimpsed them. They saw them afar off. And what enabled them to see them afar off? Their faith, their trust in God, their acknowledgement that God says he's going to do. If he says he's going to do something, he's going to do something. I trust that, and that enables me to see these promises. This city that has foundation that we're promised, can we see that? Do we have an honest expectation of that? And what enables us to have that? Our faith, our trust. Dave.
Dave mentioned it last week. It's not a blind faith. There were things that happened that proved, the Son proved, some of the things that God was telling him was going to happen in the future.
Right.
So it's not a blind faith that all these things are going to happen, but you're not going to see any evidence of that prior. But you got to see evidence of things that happened all along the way.
Right.
That's just one example of it. Dave mentioned it last week. God's never asked us to have blind trust or blind faith.
No, he always proved his word was true, and often he did it before the word was given. Remember, the apostles in the New Testament had the power to work miracles, and they did that before they spoke often to prove that they had authority from God and what they were saying was true. All right, these all. Oh, Roberta.
You know what's so funny?
I want to get past more than 7 verses this week.
Okay, I'll take your hand. God always is like, makes me think back about all the times he's helped me and saved me, but as a weak human, I still always say, yeah, but this time you won't. I know you have for 56 years, but this time you won't, I do still struggle with that.
Okay, so do we all have, to ease Roberta's guilt, do we all have moments of doubt in our faith? Yeah, Mark? Yes. Dave already brought up Abraham. When he's traveling, twice he said, this is Sarah, she's my sister. Which, was that technically true? Yeah, she was his half-sister. But what was the primary relationship? She was his wife. Did Abraham, for the majority of his life, did he trust? Did he have moments of doubt? Should he have had moments of doubt? Well, no, I'm not justifying anything. But did he recover from those moments of doubt? Yeah.
All the way up to sacrificing his son.
Which we'll get to, assuming I can get past more than 7 verses. No, I love the discussion. I pick on Roberta because I can pick on Roberta. But I love the discussion that we have in this class. So these all died in faith, not having received the promises, assured of them from afar off, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. This statement, I think, is hugely important. So when I confess that I'm a stranger or that I'm a pilgrim on the earth, what am I saying? That this world is not my home, like we sing? Do we really buy that?
The older I get, I do.
So Roberta gets senile and old, and
Yeah.
can't remember where she lives and acknowledges that she's a stranger and a sojourner, a pilgrim. Who here got worked up about the election? I don't care which way, one way or the other. Who here gets worked up about stay-at-home orders and masks? And like Roger talked about, the people who say you should wear masks and not travel, and then they don't wear masks and don't travel. They get tricked by hairdressers in California. But if I'm a stranger and I'm a pilgrim here, if I'm just a passing through, what should my attitude be about this? That I can have some peace. That I can kind of disconnect myself from some of the cares and concerns, right? Because this doesn't affect me. My home is somewhere else. I'm going somewhere else. San Francisco, a couple of years, added to their budget $186,000 salary for a handful of people who their whole job was to go clean up human excrement off the streets. Okay? Me, as a resident of Boise, I can look at that and have concerns and maybe a little bit of amusement and disappointment in humans and feel all kinds of weird feelings about that. Does that really affect me? What happens in the city of San Francisco? That's not my home. I can still go visit. I can still go drive through. There are certain places I'm obviously going to avoid now that I know what they hire people to do. But I'm a stranger there. I'm a pilgrim there. I'm a sojourner there. I can go there and I can stay the night. I can spend a week. I can do whatever. But that's not my home. I think that's the idea that we have here, that I'm confessing because of my faith that I'm a pilgrim here, I'm a traveler, I'm a sojourner, I'm a stranger, I don't fit in here, I don't belong here, because of the trust that I have in God and that expectation of that city with foundations that I'm looking for beyond this place. Anything else in verse 13? Verse 14, I'll answer my own question. Verse 14 piles on that. For those who say such things, who confess that I really don't belong here, declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And why would we seek a homeland? Because we don't have one here now. Verse 15, truly if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. So think about Abraham. Where was he called out from? Ur of the Chaldees. And we see that area eventually becomes the nation of Babylon. Could Abraham have turned around and come back? He had family there. He had an inheritance there. He had all this stuff there, if he would have thought about it and decided that that's what he wanted to do. But did he ever do that? He never really called it to mind. So if they had thought about what they had come out of, they could have gone back to it. Same is true of us. Have we been called out of the world? Could we go back to it? This is also a warning for the Hebrews who received this letter. They are considering going back to what they'd been called out of, but their hero, Abraham, didn't. So if they thought about what they'd left, they could have gone back to it. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Same as us, same as what we just talked about. Therefore, because they desire that, because they're not at home here, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has a city prepared for them. God is not ashamed to be called their God. I think that's a powerful statement because of that hope, because of that feeling of homelessness here, that we're expecting something better, that God is not ashamed to be called their God. I think just that simple little statement has a lot of power to it, that God is proud to be called their God, that he's not ashamed of these people who claim to follow him. How do we apply that? And does that lend us strength? Is God ashamed to be called our God? Or is God the opposite of that? Is God proud to be called our God? Anything on this paragraph here? Okay, verse 17. we go back to the examples now. We have a list of examples and we have application, then a list of examples and then some application. In verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. So, by faith, Abraham, in verse 17, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. We all know this story, right? Here's your son. All right, I want you to go kill him. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. Was Isaac Abraham's only begotten son? No, he was Sarah's only begotten son. Who else did Abraham have? Ishmael. Okay, Sarah dies, Abraham marries Keturah, and he has a whole mess of other sons. So was Isaac Abraham's only begotten son? He was the only begotten son of promise. That's the important one. That's the one that God addressed. That's the one that we're looking at here. So no, it wasn't his only literal son, but it's the one that was promised and the one that we're looking at here. So he offered up Isaac, who was that promised son. Does it feel like God's kind of teasing Abraham a little bit? I want you to have a son. Okay, great. I'm going to use my servant Eliezer. No, not him. Okay, well, I'm going to use my wife's handmaid Hagar, and we're going to have Ishmael. And God says, no, not him. You're going to have this one. And Abraham finally gets Isaac, and then God says, okay, kill him. But did Abraham trust God? And he did the things that God told him to do. So he was tested. He offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. This one specifically is the one that you're going to have. Now go kill him. And in verse 19, we see Abraham's thought in this, which is amazing. And we don't read this in the Old Testament. We don't read this in Genesis. But Abraham concluded that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. So Abraham was willing to not only believe that Isaac was the son that God promised, which God told him, that all these descendants were going to come through Isaac, which God told him, but that if he killed him like God told him to, that he'd raise him back up because he believed that Isaac was the one that he promised. Is that not amazing trust in what God told him? I think that's amazing faith, that he's willing to do that and still believe that Isaac was the chosen one. Even if I kill him, he's still going to do this through Isaac. I think that's awesome. I think that's amazing. Now, it says that he received him in a figurative sense. How did he receive Isaac raised up in a figurative sense?
He was so old when it happened.
He what?
He was so old when he happened. It was like, as I said before, that he was like, where it said that.
Oh, that he was as good as dead?
Yeah.
So are you saying that he thinks that Abraham received Abraham back up from the dead? So I think it's Abraham received Isaac raised figuratively. How was Isaac raised from the dead figuratively? Dave?
Well, he was intent, he was going to kill him. In his mind, he was dead.
Okay.
And figuratively, he gets him back.
Okay. Yeah, so in Abraham's mind, Isaac was as good as dead. So when the angel stops him and says, don't kill him, it's like Abraham received Isaac back literally, or well, figuratively raised from the dead, because he was going to, don't squint at me, I know. Thought you were making fun of me, mixing up figuratively and literally. No, Abraham got Isaac back figuratively. I had to think about it. Figuratively, because in his mind, he's as good as dead, because I'm going to kill him because that's what God asked me to do. So when he doesn't kill Isaac, he's receiving him back from the dead figuratively. And I only point that out because later in the chapter we're going to see the same thing about the rest of us getting our lives back, or the rest of these examples getting their lives back from the dead figuratively. Okay, in verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning the things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning on the top of his staff. How did these guys who offered blessings to their kids offer those blessings by trust?
They're essentially, I'm using this loosely, predicting the future of these people. In fact, they're trying to steer, in some ways, the future of these people. Do they have the power to steer the future of these people? Well, no, except through God.
Okay.
Except through their faith that God will see that happen.
So Mendel says, for those who didn't hear, that they're essentially predicting the future, and you said figuratively, or essentially. Loosely.
They're not fortune tellers. That's not what I'm saying.
No, they're not guessing the future. But who told them what to say when they blessed their kids? God did. So they're trusting what God told them to give to their kids, and they're doing it. Now think of some of the blessings that some of these kids got. Some of them were obnoxious blessings. What, Levi and Simeon, they were told, you guys are going to be obnoxious. And their father has to lay their hands on their head and says, God says you're going to be obnoxious. Judah, his father lays his hand on his head and says, that's where we start hearing about the Lion of Judah, that Judah, you're going to be like a lion, and you're going to have a leader that comes out of your line, and everyone else is going to bow to this leader. And the rest of the sons are like, hey, wait a minute. Would it be hard for Jacob to say that to Judah when his favorite was Joseph and his second favorite was Benjamin? Yeah, but by their trust in God, they're giving these blessings that God directed to give, even though it was probably a little bit uncomfortable there for a while afterwards after they gave those blessings. We see it with Jacob and Esau. Esau's upset about the blessing and everything that went along with that. So they trusted God. Verse 22, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. When Joseph dies, that family is in a prominent position in Egypt. Joseph, like we talked about in the lesson this morning, Joseph is the second in command of the entire nation of Egypt. And at that time, Egypt was the world superpower. What was Joseph's instructions concerning his bones after he died? Yeah, when y'all come out, you take my bones with you and bury me in the land that God promised. And how much later did that happen? 400 years. So did Joseph trust what God promised Abraham so long before, regardless of what the current situation was? He trusted it enough that he didn't say, if we kind of get out of here, I want you to take my bones with me. When we come out, I want you to take my bones with you because I want to be buried in that place that God promised my great-granddad. Anything on that section? Verse 23 then. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempted to do so, were drowned. All right, Moses. When he was born, he was hidden 3 months by his parents. Whose faith hid Moses? His parents. He said they thought he was a good-looking baby, but they were not afraid of the king's command. Were they afraid of the king's command? Yeah, because they hid him. what overpowered their fear of the king's command? Their obedience, their trust, their faith in God. We're going to see a few things here where people weren't afraid. When we read those accounts, those people are afraid. But in comparison to their trust in God, it's as if they don't have that fear. That fear's not going to keep them from what God has expected them to do. So by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents. If you want to see an amusing account, go back to Exodus chapter 2, where Pharaoh gives the command that I want all the male babies to be killed, because he first gives this command to the midwives, in the Israelite midwives, and they don't do it because they fear God more than they fear Pharaoh. So these Hebrew midwives aren't killing the male children like Pharaoh says that they're supposed to do. And Pharaoh calls them on it. He calls the two of them and he says, "Why aren't you doing this?" And their answer is, "Hey, these Hebrew women are more lively. These Hebrew women are way more lively than your Egyptian women, because by the time they get there, the kids are already out and we don't have to do anything. So we can't just kill them then." I thought that was amusing, that these Hebrew women are tougher than your Egyptian women. But they're not listed here, but they're showing faith. They're showing trust in God above and beyond the fear that they're facing in this life. Remember who's getting this letter. Jewish Christians who are facing persecution and are afraid of the things that are happening to them in this life. We're seeing these people, Moses' parents, they hid him for 3 months. And then what do? They chuck him in a river. Does that, not like, but they put him in a river. That takes some trust. That takes some faith. Some hope that God's going to intervene, that God's going to help them. So they weren't afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Here again, Moses knew what he was giving up when he gave it up. He was 40 years old when he gave it up, and he knew what he was giving up. And he chose, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin, the temporary pleasures of sin. The recipients of this letter have to make that same choice. Do they choose to suffer with the people of God, or do they choose to give it up for something easier? It's a powerful example, especially to those people, rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Who here doubts that sin is pleasurable? Because it is. That's why it's tempting. All right. Then the passing pleasures of sin. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. How did Moses suffer the reproaches of Christ?
He believed in the promises.
Okay.
He knew that there was a Christ coming.
He knew that there was promise to the nations through Abraham. I don't know if the Messiah had been prophesied at that point yet. I'm not sure.
The promises. He believed in.
So he believed the promises.
Suffered the reproach of Christ.
Okay.
Because of that belief.
But why does it say Moses suffered the reproaches of Christ?
Christ was prophesied from the garden.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that they got that yet. They don't see him as the Messiah. Yeah, you're right. You're right. When talking about the snake, Satan, you're going to bruise his heel and he's going to crush your head. So we do see that, but I'm not sure at Moses' time that was recognized as the Messiah that was going to come and save the people. But why do we see Mindel?
Well, he gave up prosperity and a title and everything to serve his people. So he lowers his rank, he suffers disgrace, as he puts it here. But also, he suffered in other ways. I mean, he suffered as he was trying to get the people out and everything. He suffered as they wandered in the wilderness. He suffered the people's grumbling and complaining.
Right.
and after the week, there was lots that he sacrificed and went through to serve his people, just like Christ sacrificed and suffered for his people.
And I think that's what we're looking at, that Moses suffered the same reproaches that Christ suffered. So, Christ gave up the opportunity for power, right? Moses gave up the opportunities for power. Christ suffered reviling from the leaders of the time. Moses suffered reviling from the leaders of the time. Christ had to deal with the complaints of God's people and the rejection a lot of time of the people that were supposed to follow him. Moses suffered the complaints of God's people and had to deal with the rejection of the people that were supposed to follow him. That their whole life, both of them gave up things, they suffered because of trying to do what was right. And what Mendel said is what I think as well, that Moses and Christ are kind of the same pattern, and Moses suffered similar things to what Christ suffered. Does that make sense? Okay, anything else that we want to look at or address there? All right, so he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater, that reproach was more valuable to him than the treasures in Egypt because he looked towards that reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Did Moses fear the wrath of the king? He did. He ran away at first. Now, when God appears to Moses in the bush, does Moses want to go back and do that? No. Why? In part, because he's afraid of the king.
God tells him they're all dead, all the people that wanted to be dead are
Right, but he still doesn't want to go back. So what does God tell him? First of all, I'll let Aaron go with you. And second of all, I told you to do it, I expect you to do it. And that was, he respected, trusted, obeyed God more than he feared the wrath of the king. It says here that he didn't fear the wrath of the king. In comparison to his trust of God, he might as well have not feared the wrath of the king, because he acted on his trust of God more than he acted on his fear of the king. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. How do you see someone or see something that is invisible?
Like Mendel said, he's looking forward to seeing him really. He already knows there's more to look forward to.
Right.
With the evidence he already has.
It's seeing, it's trusting, it's observing what we can't put our fingers on, what we can't shine that flashlight on that we talked about last week.
You got to hear it. You didn't see God, you got to hear it.
Yeah.
Somebody speaks to you through a burning bush.
You would at least pay some attention,
Yeah, you would.
which is what he did. All right, so he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He trusted that promise. He trusted what he couldn't observe. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Hey, if you smear a bunch of blood on your door, it's going to save your life. But it did. And it did because he trusted, because they trusted. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Imagine this position that the Israelites were in. You've got the most powerful army in the world. Remember, Egypt is the only world superpower at this time, and he's got all of their army coming at you, and you're trapped. You've got water here and this unbeatable army here, and God says, well, you're just going to walk across through here like it's dry land. Okay. But that's what he wound up doing. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea. Remember, Moses had to raise up his stick over the water for it to work. Moses did that. He did what God asked, even if he didn't think it made sense at the time. Anything on that section there? Okay. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, torment, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth, and all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having obtained something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So let's go through this paragraph a little bit quickly. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. How did the walls of Jericho fall down? God made them collapse, but what did the people have to do? They had to obey. They had to walk around the city once on one day, once on the second day, once on the third day, once on the fourth day, once on the fifth day, once on the sixth day, and then on the seventh day, they had to walk around the city 7 times, right? They really had to be moving. And then they all had to yell and blow horns, because that was the standard siege tactics at the time, right? Was that how you're supposed to conquer cities? Walk around them and yell? I mean, maybe if you're Bailey, you could knock walls down with your voice. But they did that. I'm sorry, I'll pay for that one later. They did that because they trusted God. God said, this is how you're going to do it. And they said, okay. They trusted even though they didn't fully understand. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. Remember, when the spy, she keeps the spies safe, and then she says, I want you to save my family, because we've seen what is happening. She's observed it. She hasn't been told it like God's people have, but she's observed what they did to those other kings who opposed them on the other side of the river. And she knows you're gonna do whatever God lets you do. You're going to take this city. I want you to protect me and my family when you do that. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon. How did Gideon have faith? He had an army of 300 people destroy this massive army that was encamped against him with jugs and torches and trumpets, right? Now, we talked about how we're not expected to have just a blind, baseless faith. Remember, Gideon asked God for proof twice. The story of the fleece. I'm going to throw this fleece out on the ground, and I want you to put all the dew on the fleece, but none on the ground. And God does. And then the next morning, okay, I'm going to throw the fleece out again, but I want the fleece to be dry and the ground to be wet. And God does. And Gideon says, okay, I'm going to do what you say. Barak. Who's Barak? He's the one that what? Made Deborah go to war with him. Right. Because who was the judge? Was Barak the judge? Deborah was the judge. And Deborah goes to Barak and says, I want you to be my general and lead my armies out there. And he goes, okay, but you got to come with me. We'll be victorious if you come with me. And she goes, okay, but I'm going to get all the glory. And he said, fine. So she goes with him, but he trusted that God would make them victorious in that instance. We've got Samson. It's interesting that Samson's here. I can't think of a bigger jerk other than maybe Herod the Great than Samson. But did he have faith at the end?
Yes.
He did. He prayed to God, let me do this, and he trusted God to do that. Jephthah. Who was Jephthah? Another really not...
The judge that made the bad promise.
He made a promise. He's in chapter 11 of Hebrews. He's the one who said, God, let me be victorious over your enemies. Now, he wasn't a great guy to begin with before this, but he tells God, let me be victorious over my enemies, and I'll sacrifice whatever comes out of my house first, hoping it was the house cat or something like that. And then he's victorious, and his daughter comes out and he tells her that, well, I've got to sacrifice you now. And she goes along with it, and a little while later he sacrifices her like he said he would. Of David, of Samuel, of the prophets, who through faith, who through their trust in God, even when it didn't look reasonable, subdued kingdoms. We have numerous examples of them conquering kingdoms. Conquering the land of Canaan is just one example. Working righteousness, obtaining promises. We do see through faith that promises were obtained. Everything except that last one, the promise to Abraham. We see people realizing promises. Stopping the mouths of lions. Who's that? Daniel. Quenching the violence of fire. Who's that? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's buddies. Escaped the edge of the sword. So many people there. Out of weakness were made strong. We can look back to Samson there. Becoming valiant in battle. A lot of God's people. A lot of what we read about in the Old Testament were just normal, everyday folks that God says, I want you to lead my armies. And they do. Gideon was an example of that. Turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. What's an example we have of that? We do have resurrection from the dead in the Old Testament. Primarily, remember the widow that Elijah stays with during the famine? That they kept kept just enough food to keep them alive through the famine, and her son dies. So she calls him, and he goes back, and Elijah raises her son. So women received their dead to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Okay, this goes to what we were looking at with Isaac. People were tortured, and they didn't accept deliverance so that they could get this better resurrection. What's the better resurrection?
Eternal life.
Resurrected to eternal life. So what would be the lesser resurrection? Being restored to life. So if you're going to torture me and I'm going to die, I'm going to go to heaven. But if I'm going to figuratively get my life back by giving up, by quitting, by saving this life, that's kind of that lesser resurrection. I can get my physical life back, or I can get this better thing. Does that make sense? Okay. So they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings. All of God's faithful people seemed like had trials of mockings and scourgings. Yes, and of chains and imprisonment. Remember, we're looking at Old Testament examples. We're not looking at Christ's trial of mocking and discouragement. We're not looking at the apostles' chains and imprisonment. We're talking about God's prophets who were suffering incredibly for speaking God's word. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. Do we read of someone being sawn in two in the Old Testament? Right. We don't really read of this specific suffering in the Old Testament scriptures that are recorded for us. But Jewish tradition tells that it was Isaiah. That Isaiah was so obnoxious to King Manasseh, who was a really evil dude, that Manasseh had Isaiah stuffed inside a hollow log, and then he had his lumberjacks cut that log in half with Isaiah in it. The interesting thing there, Manasseh repents. And Manasseh is faithful after that, but not after he did some horrible things. So Isaiah was sawn in two. They were tempted. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute. So they're wandering about wearing animal skins because they're too poor and away from civilization to do anything else. They're afflicted. They're tormented. Remember who's getting this letter. It's people who are facing persecution, and these examples are giving to them. These people stayed faithful, and these people face this horrible stuff. What are you going to do? And this passage here, or the end of the sentence in verse 38, I think is incredibly powerful for them and for us. These people who suffered all these things, they were homeless, they were poor, they were beaten, they were punished, they were rejected, they were reviled, but of whom the world was not worthy. They faced all this, and the world wasn't good enough for them. The world punished them and rejected them and did these horrible things to them, and they're still worth so much more than the world. The world is not worthy of them. I think that's a huge statement for these heroes of faith we read in chapter 11, for the recipients of the letter at the time, and for us. Whatever we face, whatever we're tempted by, whatever we have to deal with, this world is not worthy of us. I think that's a huge statement just thrown in there. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. These people probably viewed their life as sojourners, like we should. They were pilgrims. They didn't want to stay in that cave forever. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. What was that promise? The promise in verse 39.
Salvation through Christ. Ultimate salvation.
I can kind of go along with you. She said salvation through Christ. Now, did these people realize the promise of reward after this life? Yeah. So I want to say that this is different than heaven. If you want a specific example, look at Enoch that we looked at in verse 5. What did Enoch do? He walked with God. He lived faithfully, and God took him to heaven, or reward, or whatever. He took him to where we all are going to go when we die if we're faithful. So did Enoch realize that promise? He did. So what's the promise that we get that the rest of those guys, including Enoch, didn't see?
Would it be basically the church,
Okay?
God's kingdom, the heavenly city, all of that, wrapped up in the Messiah coming?
Right. What's the third promise to Abraham? The one that none of these folks realized. That all nations would be blessed through the descendants of Abraham. All the nations, including Gentiles. Mark, you had your hand up?
I was just going to connect to that same statement. It's about grace. It's about the promise of Christ being better than everything that came before. So
Good.
it's mercy for our sins being wiped away for all time. That wasn't just available to them up until in the Old Testament, under the law.
For time's sake, I'm going to pass over some of that because there was forgiveness under the old law. We did look at that before, that their sacrifices offer forgiveness. But we didn't have that one realization of that one sacrifice, right? That was offered once for all. Remember, there were the three promises to Abraham: descendants, land, blessings. All nations blessed. Did Abraham get to see the first one? Yeah. And when they came out of Egypt, were they a pretty massive group of people that came out? Yeah, so we've got a big group of descendants. Did they realize the land promise? Those descendants two of those descendants started to. The rest of them started inheriting the land. And then under David is when they finally got all the land that they were promised, that was originally promised to Abraham. And then Solomon widened that. So everyone after David and Solomon realized the land promise. So what was the last one that was left? That all the nations are going to be blessed through the descendants of Abraham. That one's talked about through the prophets after the other two are realized. That one's talked about throughout the remainder of the Old Testament, again, after those other two are realized. But it's that promise that they didn't get, that all these people in Hebrews chapter 11 didn't get, but that we get to be a part of. It almost should be capital T, capital P. They did not receive the promise. This is the promise that they received. We get the promise that they received. So all these got a good testimony through faith, even though they didn't get this promise, but God gave something better for us so that they should not be made perfect apart from us, so we can be made perfect like they are. We got this promise, but we still need to have that same type of faith, that same type of trust that they did, that doesn't shrink back like we see back in chapter 10, verse 39. That continues to move forward, that stays strong, that's steady and consistent, that we're truly trusting in God like they did, even though we have hardships, like they did, even though we have opportunities to turn away, like they did. But we have that expectation, we have that realization of that promise, that we have something better even than what they did. All right. Thank you for letting me get through chapter 11. Anything that we want to talk about before we end? All right, let's have a quick prayer. Our Father, we're grateful to have this opportunity to come together to stir up love and good works, to consider one another, to help each other live faithful lives. We're grateful for your word that gives us these examples, and we'd ask that we would be students of your word, and that your truth would come out, that your truth would always be taught among us, that we can fully trust what you've told us and realize the promises that you've given us. We ask that we would be faithful in this life, like the examples that you've provided for us, that we would not shrink back or turn back, but that we would stay fully trusting in you in this life. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.